going to make loans and the reasons for it and how we're going to get money from overseas for these things. And I understand the reason for it. I completely agree that we, as a small island state, we are in the most vulnerable situation, and we did very little to create the climate crisis. I agree, must pay. However, I never celebrate when we get a loan or make a loan. I celebrate when I repay. And I really want us to focus on how we use this money and how we will reap benefits from it. I may have a couple of suggestions of urgent projects. The number one urgent project that is beyond my technical ability, but it is within my ability to observe and recognize the problem, is the erosion of our beaches. West Coast beaches, sir, in my family, we have had a business managing properties on the west and on the south coast. And I have data points that come from years of pictures of these properties as we offered them for rent. And sir, it might come as a surprise to you and to others, or might not. But we have beaches where in the 60s in Barbados, you had 40 or 50 feet of dry sand that could accommodate these tourists. And we sold Barbados for 50, 60, 70 years maybe as sun, sea, sand. The sun is getting hotter. The sea has in seaweed, and the sand is rapidly disappearing, sir. I am deeply concerned by this. And perhaps it is a trend that is a global trend, and we have to live with it. Or perhaps there are things that we can do. So when I do hope that the Blue-Green Bank will prioritize initiatives that will preserve what little we have left. Of course, we can see areas where the beaches have grown. Carlisle Bay, within my adult lifetime, and I will say that to be 40 years, I have gone from seeing properties on Carlisle Bay where when you stepped outside of the wall, you were in the water, to today, without exaggeration, you have 150 feet to the water's edge. Whether that is man-made as a result of the Deepwater Harbour that was built, and that has stopped the flow of sand going up the west coast. As I said at the beginning, I'm not technical, but I do hope that initiatives such as the beaches, initiatives such as how to deal with the influx of the seaweed, initiatives to deal with our rainfall, it's either drought or it's a deluge. So I do support those. I am a bit concerned, though, as to why it was that housing developers or developers are singled out in the legislation to benefit. It seems to me that that is an area that the commercial banks would best be played in. Now, you may argue that the initiatives to address environmental concerns are long-term initiatives beyond the scope of the normal banking cycle. The commercial banks want a return much earlier, and that is true. But perhaps this, I've heard various numbers, $4 billion, $5 billion, $6 billion, that is tied up in the banking sector. Perhaps we could, in addition to the Blue-Green Bank, find ways to incentivize the existing commercial banks to release that money on terms that make it attractive for them for these specific initiatives. So that would be one suggestion. And as I turn then to my final comment, sir, when I look at the legislation, the Blue-Green Bank is going to lend in areas where lending, where the traditional bankers are not interested. And that is excellent. I support it completely. It is as I said before, a longer-term return. Now, we do have insurance companies who are looking for 40, 50, 60-year returns on their money from their life insurance policies. And again, I wonder if some incentive to encourage those insurance companies to take the money out of the banking system and put it into these projects, if we could not have done that in parallel with the Blue-Green Bank. And the last point, and perhaps maybe the only thing that you may want to listen to me on, is I am really looking for transparency in this new bank. And I think that from the outset, we should have, in the bill, gone further than what currently the audited financial statements must be posted within 3 months of the end of the fiscal year of the bank, which is December 31st. I do hope that we will hold this new bank to that. But further than that, given this special and important initiative, and everyone who has presented on it has recognized how important it is, sir, I think that there should be full and complete transparency on all the loans that they are making, because they're making it for the benefit of all Barbadians. That is why we're doing it. These are not private loans from the sense that I'm going to steal your business idea and knowing about my financing of my business is going to hurt you. This is public interest merchant bank. That is from this very definition. So are we going to publish all who benefit from these loans? Will we get information on the performance of every loan? And what will be the criteria to be eligible? Remember, we had a long debate in here, sir, a few months ago to do with incentives. If you get an incentive, you must follow good labor practices. Is that all of that criteria that we saw in that new piece of legislation, should that not also be in this piece of legislation, sir? So that anyone who is benefiting from this Blue-Green Bank, and remember, these are not all loans, sir. We heard today that some of them are grants. Free money, grants, you don't ever have to repay. But you need to demonstrate that you use that money for the benefit of Barbadians, specifically for the environmental issues that we are facing, that we're not contributors towards. So transparency is very important. And finally, because this bank is going to be run by a board of directors, and I've seen and I've read very detailed as to who's going to be appointed and etc., I hope that this board is added to the list of the integrity legislation eligible persons as well, because this is talking about giving somebody a grant as well as a loan. And it seems to me that they need to be covered under that same list of persons that was in our integrity legislation. So, sir, I thank Senator Drakes for yielding to me so I could put in a few words. I'm not at my best today, having traveled yesterday. And I appreciate you doing that. And I hope that those few words have conveyed to you my support of the bill, but also my caution for transparency and for integrity to be brought to it. I thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Senator Malalou. Senator Drakes.
Thank you, Mr. President. And I don't know if I can do this publicly. I haven't asked you, but given the announcement that was made at lunch, I'd like to publicly say a warm and happy birthday to you.
Thank you very much.
You're most welcome.
I couldn't have think of a better group of friends to spend it with.
Very well, Mr. President. Mr. President, unlike Senator Malalou, I have a few things that may be extensive to say about this bill this afternoon. I remember when it was in the conception phase, very, very early days, because it was, I believe, and I stand corrected, but I believe it was the brainchild of the former advisor to the Prime Minister, Professor Avinash Prasad. and very informally having chit-chats about what this organization could look like. And I am very happy to see that we are now at the stage that we're bringing legislation for something that was just chit-chat and a conceptual idea, Mr. President. Mr. President, this Blue-Green Bank Bill 2024 is, in my opinion, just another piece of the framework that the government is building as it relates to what we would coin as the Sustainable Development Framework for Barbados. It really and truly starts to spell out how complex the interactions between the environment, the economy, and society are, Mr. President. And for me, I see it as one of the first steps in a very long transition, Mr. President, where societies will have to evolve to combat and to address what are both climatic and ecological challenges that we are facing. We're going to have to evolve, sir, either by choice or by force. Because what Mother Nature is saying to us is, we can have all the modeling and the predictions that we want, but there are a lot of unknowns, Mr. President, that the science is unable to predict, that when confronted with, Mr. President, we're going to be forced to take certain actions. Sir, a lot of people, and we've heard it this morning in the debate, say, these are pie-in-the-sky issues, very far from bread and butter issues on the table. But if you were a fisherman 20, 30 years ago versus being a fisherman now, this is a bread and butter issue for you. It's very clear, Mr. President. And even moving away from the economic value that we get from the environment and its resources, Mr. President, I've never seen a human being survive without clean air. I've never seen a human being survive without water, Mr. President. And I've never seen a human being survive without food, which comes from the said soil and seas that we are here talking about today. So that, Mr. President, is why every human being on earth should pay attention to these issues. And Mr. President, we are at a stage now where our reality is, we are approaching a point where we are going into survival mode, particularly in small and developing states. Last year was the first year it was recorded that we breached the 1.5 degrees Celsius threshold above pre-industrial era temperatures, Mr. President. And that time stamp is important because when you look at the pre-industrial era, that was the era where the climate was conducive for us as human beings to become acquainted with the seasons and the cycles of the earth, for us to engage in agriculture. The climate was stable, it was predictable. And it is through agriculture then we built civilizations across the globe. So having that as a benchmark clearly shows us what is possible or what is needed for us to continue what we know as modern civilization. And that period, Mr. President, is deemed by climate scientists as the Holocene. We are moving now from that Holocene into what is called the Anthropocene. What does that mean? That there's so much greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere that we as human beings are affecting the natural climatic processes of the earth. So the 8 billion humans on earth are now engaging in activity that is sufficient enough that we ourselves are impacting the earth. But Mr. President, what we would call the emissions of CO2 into the atmosphere, sometimes we speak about it as though it is, like a by the way. It is something that has happened. But what it actually is a waste product. It is a waste product of the system that we know as from the economic system. The economic system brings in energy through fossil fuels, it transforms it into electricity and energy and products and all these other things, and through that process, the waste product that we have to grapple with now is CO2 emissions. But it is unfortunate, Mr. President, that there is sometimes a singular focus on addressing CO2 emissions through climatic interventions such as mitigation, adaptation, and resilience, Mr. President. Because the climate crisis is not the only issue that is impacting the Earth's capacity for us to survive. Sir, if you dig deeper, you will see that the Earth's capacity to sustain life has been breached since the 1970s. So we're using more resources from the Earth at a rate that is higher or larger than the Earth's resources are able to regenerate and reproduce. Since the 1970s, we are at a stage now where, according to the science, and I've mentioned this in a previous debate, 6 of 9 planetary boundaries have been breached. So it is not just CO2 emissions that we have to deal with. There are things like biodiversity loss, and not just in quantity, but no, scientists are stating in terms of genetics, Mr. President. The proliferation of microplastics, pesticides, nuclear waste. All of these things, Mr. President, are compounding because of what is known as the economic system and the impacts that it is having on Earth's natural processes. Sir, we are at a place now in 2024 where we're using 1.75 times the Earth's capacity to sustain all people on planet Earth. 1.75 times the Earth's capacity to sustain all people on the planet Earth. And essentially, what does that mean? As I said, we're taking all of these natural resources, wood, minerals, metals, etc., from the Earth. We're taking species, whatever it may be, Mr. President, and we're funneling it into the economic system to produce products, provide services, increase trade, develop technological products, for instance, Mr. President. And that rate is unsustainable. So in addition to the CO2, Mr. President, there is a gamut of other ecological issues that we have to address, and we have to make them more vocal so that people understand it's not just this singular focus on climate change, but we are dealing with an ecological crisis as well. Sir, I wanted to put that as my first set of comments because that speaks then to the capacity issue. There's something called carrying capacity. And I want us to keep that in mind as I go through the presentation. Sir, when we talk about this Blue-Green Bank, it is clear what the objectives are. We've heard that we need to funnel more private financing to invest in activities that reduce greenhouse gas emissions and other adaptation and resilience measures, which we know is needed. But, Mr. President, what this Blue-Green Bank is, it is a clear indication of a first mover attempt to innovate this financial space on how we go about attracting that financing, and also, Mr. President, to plug the financing gap. So that financing gap in relation to climate intervention measures is large. I heard the senator who led the debate, Dr. Chantal Monroe, the Honorable Senator, state some numbers earlier this morning. But, sir, what I would want to say to the chamber is that there's a report by the UNFC on the Standing Committee on Finance, and they have a first report on NDCs, nationally determined contributions, and those are the contributions or the commitments that countries make in relation to how they are going to tackle the climate crisis. And that report stated that developing countries across the world need approximately $5.8 to $5.9 trillion to close the financing gap. We're not talking about millions, we're not talking about billions, we are talking about trillions of dollars for existing commitments that has nothing to do with future commitments that could possibly come up. Mr. President, in Latin America and the Caribbean region where we reside, that financing is US $168 billion. So the $100 million of capital financing that's going into the Blue-Green Bank is a drop in the bucket of what is needed regionally when we include Latin America for climate financing. Sir, and Barbados has been very coherent when you go through the documentation on how we are trying to deal with this financing gap. So I bring to the Chamber's attention our first update to the NDCs, our nationally determined contribution to our COP commitments. On page 31 of our first update, it says that there's a need to significantly scale up existing catastrophe-triggered financial instruments. We know that the government, and we passed it in this chamber, for the natural disaster clause for debt instruments. And it goes on to say that while developing new innovative instruments that incentivize resilience building, the new instruments should address the debt burden of vulnerable developing countries. And if I'm hearing the government correctly, this is not additional debt that the government is taking on, but it is shifting financing that is already on the table to establish the Blue-Green Bank, which, Mr. President, is clearly a part of the first update of the NDC for Barbados. Mr. President, I want to put that in context because if we are not adding more debt in trying to create this bank, then it is a clear indication then that we are trying to be innovative with the existing debt that we have. Clearly, it's not enough, particularly if the US, if it's US $100 million, I stand corrected, or Barbados, I'm not sure because the denomination of the currency has not been clear in the debate. But nonetheless, it is not enough for the type of projects that this bank should be targeting. And Mr. President, this issue of the financing gap is critical for countries like Barbados. This year alone, the government of Barbados has an estimated fiscal deficit of $1 billion. So if your existing needs you can't satisfy, and this is you trying to maintain schools, trying to maintain roads, make sure the hospital is running, make sure policemen are paid. How then, Mr. President, on any given day, would a government find the financing to do these necessary, but not the bread and butter issues, as people will call them, to address these needs? You have to find a way. Because once these issues become systemic and endemic in your country, Mr. President, they will then start to become more problematic throughout the entire system. And what will suffer? Your economy will suffer, and people will suffer, Mr. President. So I want Barbadians and all those who can hear my voice to understand that this is not esoteric. This is real, Mr. President. It is very real for countries like Barbados. And I believe that through the mechanism of blended finance, we can make some inroads into closing that finance gap that is so critical for small island developing states to institute and implement the needed adaptation and resilience measures, Mr. President. But, sir, as much as I am in support of the bill, like my colleague to the left, Senator Malalu, there are some concerns. Sir, the first set of things that I would call concerns in relation to the bank deals with the operations. I listened to the debate in the lower house as best as I could I tried to get in as much of that interaction that happened in the other place. And what I was looking for was a very detailed explanation of how this bank will work. For the first time today, Mr. President, we heard what type of bank, as I'm sure, I don't know how many others, that this is a merchant bank. That's the first time I've ever heard it. And so what I'm saying is the government has to be clear when they're bringing about these types of new innovations, that greater detail as practical is given to the public so that you quell some of the anxiety around what is it they're doing? They're bringing more debt. We don't understand, it's for the friends, the family, slush funds, and all the other terminology that comes around in the rebuttal of something new, something different. Right, Mr. President? And for me, what I would have thought would have been the better course of action in relation to this bank in particular, as it already has some level of capitalization, some type of public prospectus that starts to so that people can have it, they can understand, again, how it's capitalized, what's the type of the financial services it's going to provide in the short to medium term, and so that people have some kind of understanding and greater level of knowledge about what will be happening.
On a point of order, Mr. President, I do not wish to say that the Honourable Senator is misleading the House, because I do not think that is the intent of the Honourable Senator, even though it may be a consequence of what the Honourable Senator said. But just by way of information, a prospectus is coming with all of the public details and data so that those interested in investing, those interested in scrutinizing, those interested in analyzing, those interested in promoting, to get investors, will be able to see all of the information, because there will be, as Senator Malalou said in his own remarks, absolute transparency on this matter. The question of the prospectus is really a matter of sequencing. You cannot put out a prospectus for something that is not in existence. And it is not in existence until it passes both chambers of the House, and until the legislation is in fact assented to by Her Excellency the President. So until that time, you cannot, you could expose yourself actually to a charge of fraud if you were to put out a prospectus for something that really does not exist. All you could talk about was a concept of something that you are proposing, but you cannot put out the prospectus. In the private sector may be at liberty to if they're going to have initiate a new business, to put out a prospectus and say that is what we are proposing, because they don't have the same legal requirements as government.
Thank you. Senator Grace, please continue.
Thank you, Mr. President. Essentially, what I'm saying is there's a lack of detail, whether it is in the form of even making available the documentation that was given to the already existing investors, because you have capitalization. So something must be in writing somewhere about what this bank is intended to do, with some level of detail that persons and countries felt comfortable enough and confident enough to invest in. That is all I'm saying, Mr. President, as it relates to information going out to the people of Barbados. So my other point in relation to operations, and I'm going to speak now about another innovation that the government recently piloted. What is the bank's intended relationship with the Barbados Environmental Sustainability Fund? Is a relationship intended? Is there going to be some level, because this bank can give grants, and again, I don't know details, so is there some level of overlap happening there? Some level of duplication? Is one, no, because the bank has a greater level of financing, will that crowd out the projects that are going towards the BESF? So for me, it is unclear, and I haven't heard anyone speak about it, but what would the relationship between this Blue-Green Bank and the Barbados Environmental Sustainability Fund, what would that look like, given that they're both able to provide grant financing for these types of projects, Mr. President? And while I'm on that, Mr. President, we're starting a new bank. We established BESF, I believe it was last year. There has been no public update on how that organization is functioning, what type of projects, that they're receiving, what is the level of demand even in relation to projects through that grant financing facility. I don't know, Mr. President. You would have to apprise me, the government would have to apprise me on where the BESF is in terms of its status. But that is something, Mr. President, I think could be clarified by the government. Sir, the other issue I want to raise here is similar to Senator Malulu, and that is this issue of who is to benefit in relation to the business of the bank and the explicit inclusion of what is termed real estate developers. And I have no issues with real estate developers being included, but why that explicit reference? Why that explicit reference? And I understand the concept that, you're going to have to do a lot of adaptation and resilience measures as it relates to housing and so on. But why that focus? It has in the legislation, and as the bank deems fit in relation to other businesses. So why do you need to include and explicitly state real estate developers? You didn't explicitly state small entrepreneurs. You didn't explicitly state small microfinancing projects. Why real estate developers? That is something, Mr. President, I think should be clarified for the public and anyone who reads the legislation. That clearly then, myself and Senator Malulu, we both flagged it because putting it in legislation means there's some level of intent there. And the question has to be why. Also, Mr. President, the other thing I want to ask is, and I take the point that this is a merchant bank, but I still have ambiguity around who is the client, who is the target client of this bank. Other banks, other financial institutions for leveraging, yes. But then once you get that blended finance, you get persons to come on board in terms of capitalization, who is this supposed to benefit? Because who is your target audience, whether it's microfinancing, large financing, that then determines how you design the financial instruments that are designed in the bank. I am not clear, Mr. President, on who are the target clients for the bank. Because on one hand, I am hearing about large-scale infrastructural projects, and then on the other hand, in the other place, and they here today, I am hearing about people who are in the transportation sector, ZR drivers, taximen who want to transition their cars from fossil fuel cars, internal combustion engines, to hybrids and electric vehicles. So how is the bank rationalizing who is the primary target and client? There has to be some contemplation about who those persons are. Mr. President, the other thing I want to mention here in terms of operations is capacity. Capacity, the technical capacity. Because technical and human capacity, based on the same report that I mentioned earlier as it relates to an assessment done on the NDC's National Determined Contributions, the two most important climate transition needs were 1, capacity building, and 2, technological transfer and development. The third was then climate financing. And I appreciate that, yes, climate financing is being addressed in this bill. It has to, at some point. But are we then going to create a bottleneck where we have the financing, but we don't have the technical and the human capacity to roll out and implement a lot of the projects that will come to the bank? And if you think what I'm saying may sound far-fetched, we did it with renewable energy. We created an environment where money can be attracted, but the technical capacity of the grid said, halt, cease, I can't hold no more. So, Mr. President, how are we dealing? We're addressing the financing issue, but do we really understand the technical and the human resources that are needed for the interventions and the rollout of the projects that we are talking about? And sir, I want to mention another area here that takes me back to this issue of capacity and our ability to sustain life on Earth. This bank is being created in the context where Barbados currently has a number of environmental issues. Whether we are talking about coral reef bleaching, declining near shore biodiversity, whether we are talking about soil erosion, so even solid waste management in terms of recycling, overfishing in some of our commercial species, water scarcity, land use change, Mr. President, particularly on our coastlines as it relates to tourism development. That is the context by which this bank is being created. Sir, if the Blue-Green Bank and the persons who are charged to operate it have no clear indication of what the baseline for those key ecological areas are, how are they making decisions on these projects? Because unlike economic data and social data that are periodic, timely, and more or less consistent, that is not the case with environmental data in Barbados. That is not the case, Mr. President. So we are constructing a bank that is supposed to do climate interventions and support blue and green economy, and I'll get to that in relation to its definition, without, in my estimation, and I stand corrected, maybe like the former senator who spoke this morning, it's a problem with access. The data is available, so we say, but I don't have access to it. So how is it then that the bank, Mr. President, is going to make decisions on things like overfishing in some areas, soil erosion, land degradation, in terms of the projects that comes across the desk if they do not understand or know the baseline and the trends associated?
On a point of order, Mr. President, sir.
Point of order.
That the honourable member is misleading the House, and on this occasion I cannot say that it is entirely out of innocence. Mr. President, sir, Barbados has a long history, perhaps the best in the Caribbean, of collecting data. We have the oldest town planning system in Barbados, and as a result of that, a lot of data was collected. We had the first coastal zone management unit in the Caribbean, and in some instances, before many countries in Latin America, and a lot of data has been accumulated over the years because of it. We have a fisheries division that has a long history of data collection about catches, the size of catches. In fact, it is on that basis that we have more moratoria on sea eggs. We have restraints in relation to what can and cannot be caught. So there is data available on many of the blue and green areas on which the bank is going to be called to make a decision. However, I concede that even with a history of data and a history of data collection and a history of data availability, that because of rapid climate change, the environment is changing rapidly. And that is true for every country in the world, no matter how good your collection, collation, analysis, and publication is.
Thank you, Senator Thompson. Point is made.
Thank you,
Senator
Mr. President.
Grace, please continue.
And I thank the Senator, the Honorable Deputy President, for that intervention, because she made mention of sea eggs. And I challenge anybody outside of fisheries, and even some people in fisheries, to tell me what is the population of sea eggs across Barbados. It is collected, yes, it is stored somewhere, but nobody has access easily to that information.
But what if the bank can't get it because of what you...
Well, sir, well then, the bank, what I am saying, and I will get back on the point of this, there needs to be a standardization of our environmental data reporting. We have to strengthen the Ministry of Environment and the Statistical Service in the way that we compile, collate, and report, because I know another area which nobody in this room can probably tell me what the status of that is, and that is the quality of our nearshore environment on our west coast. EPD does not share that information. But if what is what
On a point of order, the Honourable Senator is misleading the House. The Honourable Senator is conflating her ignorance, her admitted ignorance, and I use that in the proper context, English context of the word, and attributing it to civil servants. The fact that she is unaware, the Honourable Senator is unaware, does not mean that the information is not collected and available. The information is done, the testing is done. Testing of our nearshore has been done for years. What I would agree with, and there's a difference between the collection, the collation, the analysis, and the reporting of it, that a lot of the information is not necessarily put into the public domain. But that does not mean that technocrats don't have it. It doesn't mean that it isn't available. And it doesn't mean that because she is ignorant that the technocrats and other people are.
That's not Senator Rex.
Mr. President, I am ignorant, and so are other civil servants who do not even share the data between ministries. So I don't know how then the directors of this bank and the managers of this bank will get hold of some of this information, which is critical to the projects that will come before them, Mr. President. And that is my substantive point. I move on, Mr. President. Sir, we have a piece of legislation before us, and that is why I spoke about data and the availability of data and the access to data. We have a piece of legislation before us that has two definitions that are critical to the bank's operation. The first is the blue economy. And it states the blue economy means the sustainable use of ocean resources to benefit economies, livelihoods, and ocean ecosystem health. The second definition is a green economy. It means the kind of economy that reduces environmental risk and ecological dangers by encouraging economic activity that does not degrade the environment. Mr. President, dare I say that both of those definitions are inadequate. They are inadequate because by any measure of the stretch, they are definitions that would be classified as areas of weak sustainability. If we have the type of environmental issues that we have to be looking at definitions that classify as strong sustainability, Mr. President, because what we are telling persons is, once you don't degrade the environment, you don't pose any risk. But all the while you have stressed ecological systems that aren't getting any better, but you're telling businesses or these projects, or, once you don't degrade it even further, Mr. President, we will give you financing. And I do not believe that should be the threshold or that should be the standard for this type of bank, Mr. President. But I will deal with that matter in committee. Sir?
Mr. President, sir.
What's the point of order?
The honourable senator is misleading the chamber by suggesting that the framing of the language permits further degradation of systems that are already degraded. In fact, it is standard legislation in Barbados that environmental impact assessments, social impact assessments, and other impact assessments must be done as part of the project development process before you can even get financing in many instances, so that there are protective systems in place, and I'm speaking because I can't speak in committee. There are protective systems in place, there are strong mechanisms available to ensure that there isn't degradation, or that where there is degradation, engineering can be put in place which halts it, or if there is degradation that cannot be halted by engineering, then the project cannot go ahead. And there are projects in Barbados that have been refused because they have not met EIAs, SIAs, and other standards that government has had in place.
Thank you, Senator Thompson. Senator James.
Thank you, Mr. President. And yet, we have this continued negative trend of our ecological systems across Barbados, both on land and at sea. But, sir, I continue. Sir, what I would like to move on to lastly is a more technical point. And I will end here because I see Senator Thompson, Her Honor, Deputy President, itching to probably intervene, but don't worry, this is a technical point. The construction and framing of this bank is very much aligned with what scientists or some social scientists that deal with ecological economics would call environmental pragmatism. Environmental pragmatism is when you have a suite of tools or mechanisms that fit comfortably into the existing capitalist structure of your society. And therefore, that is why we continue as a globe and as a human race, although measures are being put in place, we have not addressed the root problem, which is the economic design. Sir, what I want to put towards the House, and I will probably make it, I will make it a document of the House. This issue in relation to the connection between money creation, fiat money in particular, its lack of physical backing and disconnect between environmental and ecological value, and the link between debt, the disconnect that interest and capital accumulation have with physical resources, Mr. President, is the root of our problem. Globally, Mr. President. And that is not being realized by persons who have understood that what we are doing in terms of the mainstreaming of providing financing mechanisms to solve environmental problems will not work. Why? Because the capitalist nature in terms of the drive to increase growth and profits will always take center stage over ecological health and integrity, Mr. President. And the document that I want to put as a document of the House is a white paper by Open Earth, and it is titled Nature-Based Currencies, Integrating Natural Capital in Advanced Monetary Systems. And that paper speaks to the creation of a new type of money that is linked to the natural assets of a country, a nation, a region, where you can only trade and that money only brings greater value if the ecological health of that nation or region is also enhanced, Mr. President. And that is where I believe the bank will have to go eventually if we are to solve a lot of these problems that we are facing, Mr. President, in addition to the climate interventions as it relates to climate resilience and adaptation, Mr. President. And Mr. President, you've signaled to me on a number of occasions, my time is running out, but I still want to make the point, this issue of data and strengthening the Ministry of Environment's ability to collect and report environmental data so that not just those who are investing in projects understand what is happening and the people in the ministries who are creating the policies, but so that Barbadians can also know what is happening in their environmental landscape. I should not have to be a special interest person, Mr. President, to get access to the water quality along the west coast of Barbados. Even researchers of the University of the West Indies don't get access to that information. So even in terms of research and building out projects that address those concerns, your best and your brightest cannot have the data. So I am not speaking out of ignorance, I'm speaking out of experience as it relates to how patchy and inconsistent some of the data is as it relates to environmental baselines in Barbados, Mr. President. And with those words, Mr. President, I'm obliged to you.
Thank you very much, Senator Drake. Her Honour, Senator Thompson.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I think this debate has been philosophical. It has been political. It has encompassed a number of areas, and I should like, with your permission, to traverse the gamut of the thematic approaches which have been used. I want to start with the points on which the Honourable Senator who just took her seat spoke. The issue of data. Barbados, and I want to reiterate, has excellent data collection systems. I think we fail in two regards. We fail in the publication of the data. We fail in making the data available for easy access. And this relates to a broader issue. So there is a difference, and this is why I interrupted the senator on more than one occasion. There is a difference between not having data and having data which the average person is unable to access. So that technical experts who are in decision-making capacities, not necessarily people who are doing academic work, would have the access. Now, this relates to a broader issue, and it has been an issue with which successive governments have had to address. To what extent is government or governments prepared to make information available to citizens? And to what extent should this data or these data sets be the domain of government experts and technocrats who are working exclusively with them? There is now actually an international agreement called IGWASU on the issue of open availability of data. And the Barbados Labour Party in its last administration, and the Prime Minister has said repeatedly that this administration favors transparency, and therefore we favor making data available to the public, even when it is not data that is necessarily favorable data. That's the best way I can put it at the moment. And sometimes, and this has been I'll give you an example, sir, on the issue of data and data availability. When I was health minister, there was a big story about levels of bacteria in the sea at particular times. the data was not made public. And I asked the head of the agency responsible, you have the data, why isn't the data public? You know, explain to me what's going on here. And the head of agencies, I had a group with our technical people, a meeting with our technical people, said, we do not make it available because the data is misleading. And I said, well, explain what you mean. And they said, if you test between X time of the day and Y time of the day, you will appear to have completely different levels, because there are certain levels that are going to peak if the testing area is close to an agricultural belt where there is substantial runoff and people are cleaning pig pens, etc. at a particular time, and it is making its way down to the water. If you take your testing early in the morning, very early, as opposed to at midday, where there may be certain levels of bacteria that are immediately killed by water temperature at a certain level, so once the sun comes out, what appears to be high bacterial content will disappear. So they give all kinds of explanations and said, traditionally, this is why we have not put the data into the public domain. Now, you could argue and you could make a case that the Barbadian public is highly aware, highly educated, and that you could put the data into the public domain and explain all of these various scientific reasons for why you would see a higher bacterial content at this location than you see at this location and at that time, than at that time, and explain it all to the public. But there is no malice in not putting it out. What has happened is that over the years, governments have tended to be more secretive or to hold on to information that they collect. And that has been a traditional practice. We are now changing that. And in fact, more and more information is going into the public domain than has ever been before. And as a result, often ministers are explaining, rationalizing, pointing out, or you're putting the data out with an explanation. So the data is there. Whether people can access it, and where I think we have a weakness is that one government agency may have their data set, they may not necessarily share it or compare with other data sets and do the analysis, but this is not a problem unique to Barbados. It is unique, it is not even unique to the Caribbean or to small island developing states. It is a challenge in developing countries generally, where you do not have the capacity, you don't have large data departments with people doing all kinds of scientific analysis. That does not mean that the data is not there, or that it cannot be made available, or that analyses cannot be done with the data sets that you do have. And the way that the argument was framed, it suggested almost that there was some reason why the data was not, either it wasn't being collected or that it was being withheld. And really you have to see it in the context of what the issue is. In fact, more and more of this data is going to become extremely critical because now of the existence of the multi-dimensional vulnerability index, where we are going to have to be using data to make comparative analyses about the risk and vulnerabilities of various small island developing states and various developing countries in relation to their, the state of their environment and the impact of climate change on society and economy and environment. So these are issues that are very much current. We heard that, and I agree with the honourable senator that, and I think she understands that I take technical points. So I think the honourable senator made the point that, you know, this is going to be a technical point, so there won't be any need to get up. I take the technical point that, and I've said already, that we really need to have a debate just for the sake of expanding and the thinking and knowing what the thinking is on development issues generally. I mean, I've said this more than once. I'm on record of saying it, that it mustn't be pursuant to a bill where you're going to take particular lines. There has to be an open debate from a philosophical perspective so that we as a nation can start to make decisions about what our direction is. But when you speak about environmental pragmatism, I entirely agree. I have to agree that the financial system is driven by profit. I have made that point in here. I lost a friend because of it. That, you know, the private sector is driven by profit, and therefore they are going to make decisions on based on how they maximize profit, and that is not necessarily in the interest of the environment or the small man or the wider society. That is just the reality of how capitalism works, and it's not an insult or an attack on any particular individual. That is the nature of capitalism, and the reality is, and it is now being recognized, that capitalism as a system has failed. There's a lot of literature out there that is speaking to the collapse of capitalism and pointing to the rifts in society, the degradation of the environment, and these horrifically inequitable economies where you have the haves have enough, and being billionaires in periods when the majority are in scarcity. How do you stop this kind of inequity where people, no matter how hard they work, cannot survive? That you are working I just came from the United States. I think, sir, I believe that the media carried some extracts of speeches that I did at the United Nations. I was horrified at the price increases when I went into stores, pharmacies, basic essentials like toiletries, Pampers, toothpaste, deodorant, makeup, basic things that everybody uses. And interestingly, in one particular popular US chain, everything was under lock and key in a glass case. What does that tell you? That the things walking out the place and they're trying to control inventory. So you have to find a staff member to get a pouch of toothpaste. We ain't get there yet in Barbados, and the price was, I mean, I think I paid $8 on something for the brand, US dollars, for the brand of toothpaste that I use. Very expensive. Right? Yes, it is expensive. And I admit that I use an expensive brand because I really try to deal with an issue that I have. Okay, so when you then go to find a staff member to open the glass case, it is a 10-minute wait because they are reducing staff. So that one person is serving 4 or 5 customers and has to go to the glass case, wait for that person to take out their stuff, lock back, come to the next person. So you may be standing up in a line where 4 or 5 other people. I mean, this was my experience only last week. I also found that there were a number of items in the stores in the US that were way above what we were paying for them here in Barbados. Way above what we were paying for them in Barbados. So we can have a conversation about capitalism. I want to move on, sir, because I do have some broader points to make. Another point that I want to make in relation to today, something that I heard in the chamber, is the failure to establish a sovereign wealth fund. The notion of a sovereign wealth fund was first raised in Barbados when I was Minister of Energy. It was raised in the context of, at that time, we were pursuing our oil and gas resources or offshore, and a sovereign wealth fund, the concept note, and we started to draft legislation, I believe, and we had policy papers on it in order to ensure that the average citizen would benefit from the oil and gas sector. It can be applied to renewable energy, and that is not to say it won't be. And in fact, it is being applied because we have indicated how HOPE will function and how the citizen will get benefits from the HOPE project. So the concept is being applied. But I want to make the point that the only administration in Barbados that got millions of dollars in revenues from the way we set up the oil and gas sector was the Democratic Labour Party, and they had the opportunity to take up the draft policy paper and the draft legislation that was there for the Sovereign Wealth Fund to ensure that it was started and that people in Barbados benefited from it. But of course, with many other things that would have benefited the public, it was not their priority. They did not bother. I can assure that insofar as benefits will come from the energy sector for Barbadians, that this administration will ensure that the average person benefits. And we have, in fact, been doing that by structuring the renewable energy sector and policy framework so that citizens can have greater disposable income and greater benefits. So, why a blue-green bank? I want to start with the fundamental that Barbados, with its 432 square kilometers of land space, of terrestrial space, has a maritime space that is 424 times its terrestrial space. So if you think of Barbados, its exclusive economic zone, its maritime space, its land space, then you are in a position to see why it is that government is placing equal emphasis on the blue economy and on the green economy. The definitions have been given, so I won't attempt to retread that ground, but simply to make the point that climate change is a driver of the way we live today. It is a driver of social activity, of economic activity and investment, and it is certainly a driver of our risk to development as a nation and as a region. All countries now have to find themselves mitigating, adapting, and building resilience. So what is mitigation, sir? Because we are using these expressions and we assume that everybody understands and is aware and is clued in to the language of currency in the multilateral space and in the academic space and in the spaces that we occupy. Because climate change is getting worse, because we ourselves are not major causes of climate change, we don't have enough greenhouse emissions ourselves to be major contributors to climate change. But we are, because we are small open economies, because of our environment, because we're an island, because we are microspace as an island, we are impacted by those who are big manufacturers, countries that are big manufacturers, large economies, which are carbon intensive in their manufacturing and other economic processes. We are forced to mitigate, and mitigation is where you adopt technologies that really reduce your carbon emissions. So solar water heaters, for instance, which cause you not to use so much electricity. Solar fields, when you put your house off-grid and you use solar instead. All of these are mitigation efforts. And you're using technology to stop your carbon emissions. Adaptation, on the other hand, is when you recognize that there is nothing you can do about what is going to happen or what is happening, and you take steps to reduce the impact, the adverse impact of climate change on you. An example would be the boardwalk in Christchurch. People think of the boardwalk as a beautiful recreation space, and it was in fact designed to look like that. But what the boardwalk in Christchurch is an engineered solution to damage being caused to your coastline as a consequence of wave action, loss of sand, and loss of the beach. So you're actually stabilizing your coastline using an engineering method, but designing it so that the population benefits and the properties on the coastline enjoy a benefit from it and so on. So that is adaptation, where you can't do anything, but you put something in place to adapt to what is happening and to stop the worst impact of what is going on. It is clear that throughout the Caribbean and globally, but particularly in small island developing states, we have to build our resilience. And resilience simply is toughness, your ability to withstand shock, or your ability to resist shock, or your capacity to recover from shock in the smallest possible time. So that in the event of, let's say, the equivalent of a hurricane, another hurricane, Elsa, you have so reinforced your housing stock that 50 miles per hour winds will not take out several thousand houses. That if you were to have a Category 3 hurricane, you would not lose most of your businesses and infrastructure. And there was a time, sir, when as a nation and as a region, we were focused on the fundamentals of education, educating a population for upward social mobility, ensuring quality health care, to ensure that our people were able to resist diseases, were not getting sick, were productive, could function in any setting. We were busy putting in basic infrastructure, pipe-borne water, and roads. But the reality is that the challenge of the modern era has to do with building environmental resilience. It has to do with ensuring that our infrastructure will not be taken out in a hurricane. It has to do, therefore, with putting your electricals underground. It has to do with reinforcing your bridges. It has to do with ensuring that you have hurricane straps and shutters, and that your housing stock can resist winds of maybe 75 to 100 miles an hour. And there is a high cost to building resilience. There is a high element of finance that is required both on the part of the average citizen and also on the part of government that has the responsibility for services, that has responsibility for a range of buildings and so on. And then you ask the question, as the Honourable Senator Drakes did, how does it impact the average person? And the senator was right, that when we talk about things like resilience, the average Barbadian doesn't feel that it has to do with them. When we use expressions like mitigation and adaptation, we are not speaking to the average person. But as she rightly pointed out, if sargassum, which is a result of a climate impact, is so severe that fishermen cannot get the fish stocks that they normally did, they cannot get the range of species which Barbadians prefer, the eggs, the fish cannot spawn where the seaweed is blocking up the oxygen or making the environment hostile, where that is immediately an impact to thousands of households in Barbados. Immediately. If you talk about drought, so that during the summer months, and it is already extremely hot, Water is evaporating very, very quickly. So if you talk about drought, heat causing drought, you're talking about availability of water for the average person. You are talking about water for plants. You are talking about water for animals, because you have to keep your livestock alive. You are talking about the fact that your crops cannot be sustained in the ground because the water is evaporating too quickly, and crops that need high water content, particularly during the early stages, the early growth stages, they're not getting it. So several crops are affected. That impacts the average person, because then when there is scarcity, the price goes up. That impacts the average individual. Then you're talking about flooding and unseasonal rains. We've experienced all of that. We know what it is to have to re-engineer the whole of town to ensure that there isn't the severe flooding that you've had in the past. How does it affect the average citizen? It affects the average citizen when there is such severe drought in Panama that the canal is short of water and ships cannot get through it. And in a consequence, ship A is bidding against ship B. Ship A is saying to the Panama authorities, I will pay $4 million US if you let me go through the canal tomorrow. And of course, the officials say yes, because the canal is a profit-making entity. But when the goods that ship is carrying are then the price for the increase, that $4 million will find itself on your table, or at the pump, or in the store, because the price is passed on to the ultimate purchaser, who is you and me. So we cannot escape the impacts of climate. We cannot escape the cost of climate. And therefore, what this bank is attempting to do, or what the government is attempting to do with the establishment of this bank, is to align our international advocacy on climate with our domestic and parochial challenges, and the creation of solutions for all Barbadians by putting money in to the banking sector and the market to ensure it is available to banks, to credit unions, to insurance companies which need the capital. And one would hope that a higher degree of sensitivity and support will be seen on the part of the officers who are the policy-making and loan-giving individuals within the banking sector, because I have already complained about how formulaic banks have become. That one time you had a personal banker, or your banker knew you and you had banking relationships, so that bankers gave you eases based on factors that were not necessarily seen in the formula when they put in how much you earn versus how much you spend, versus the fact that your daughter going to university next month and you're going to have to pay out an additional X dollars for that. There was a level of trust that worked between bankers and clients that allowed the system to function well. Barbados has the lowest mortgage default rate in the Caribbean. And it isn't only because we have the highest incomes, which we do. It has to do with trust and opportunity. And the average person, when they got that house or that loan, was prepared to suck salt, to hold on to a house. I know what it is to have a banker say, Ms. Thompson, your loan, your mortgage on this property is 2 months in arrears. You wouldn't like to sell it. And for me, yes, for me to say to the person, black people are to own property and they're not going to let it out of their hands. So if I need to suck salt, I will suck salt, and I will bring the 2 months arrears up to date. And let me tell you how I'm going to start. I have 2 cell phones. I can give up one. And I made the adjustment, and I brought the 2 months arrears, 2 months. And a bank asked me if I don't want to sell my property. I own it still. I own it still. And more than a decade has passed since that banker put that question to me. So we need, if this system is going to work, it is all right to set up an institution, but the operation of it has to be create the enabling environment that the citizen can truly benefit from the policy intent. So when you see the Prime Minister on the international stage talking about the Bridgetown Initiative and access to affordable, available capital, this is what we are attempting to do here. It is taking control of our own destiny so that we are not paying 40% interest and 20% interest in the international marketplace when big countries who are creating the problem are only paying 2 and 4% interest rate on loans. It is about taking control. It is about establishing Barbados as a center for climate crisis mitigation, climate crisis adaptation, and climate leadership at the regional and global level. We've indicated, sir, that it is critical that the agencies that will benefit, the credit unions, the banks, the insurance companies, and others, apply policies that will allow people to truly benefit. Another thing that we don't, and this is where the bank is I think, going to be helpful, is that when we borrow money on the international markets, usually it comes with high conditionalities. In addition to that, we often have to use the foreign consultants of the very lenders so that they're creating the climate problem. They're lending you money at extraordinary, exorbitant, extortionary interests. They are then imposing severe conditionalities. They're getting back the loan repayment at a high rate, so they're making money on that. And then their consultants and their companies are getting all the work and the fees, because that is also part of the loan agreement. It is a cycle that is, what is the opposite of virtuous? Unholy? Vicious. It is a vicious cycle, really, and that is what we are caught in. So this bank is a policy intervention to break a vicious cycle which has us in a stranglehold from a problem that we did not cause, do not want, must live with, but have to learn how to navigate as a people and as a country. And therefore, sir, I am supporting it from that perspective and from what it is attempting to do in that regard. We are taking control, we are taking leadership, and some of the points today which were made that were useful are things that the government is willing to take on board. The challenges, and so I just want to make the point, because I think that I spoke earlier about climate mitigation and climate adaptation, and I explained the difference between mitigation and adaptation. And I'm going to make the point now that for countries like ours, adaptation and adaptation finance is the critical need. But in 2022, the last year for which I have data, $60.9 billion US dollars was given as loans for climate finance by the multilateral development banks. Of that, only 38.2 billion, 63% or 38.2 billion went to mitigation. But countries needing adaptation financing, there was only 22 million US dollars available. And the Honorable Senator Monroe Knight has already made the point that the need of the Caribbean and developing countries is in the trillions, but $22.7 million, which really does not come to address our needs. I close, sir, by making the point that the challenges facing the globe today are environmental. And those environmental challenges are impacting economy, they are impacting society, They are changing culture. They are forcing us to relook and refinance infrastructure. And they are impacting the lives of average citizens all over the world, and certainly here in Barbados. Recognizing that if this country is to survive, if our economy is to be sustainable, if our society, culture, and way of life are to be preserved, that an intervention is essential. The government has looked to creating a bank to address what is the chief development problem of this era. And I support entirely the government in its efforts to solve this national problem. I'm much obliged to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Her Honor Senator Thompson. Any other speakers? Senator Nurse.
Thank you, Mr. President. I shouldn't take too much of your time. And let me, at the onset, say that I support this bill for all the reasons which have been articulated already. We understand the importance of having such financing available because of all of the issues which are today affecting say, countries like ours in terms of the effects of climate, the effects of degradation along our beaches and so on, which we recognize are important to our economic activities because it represents areas where a lot of our economic activity happens in terms of tourism and so on along the coast. And so therefore, we will need specific financing readily available to be able to address these issues. And so I think that it is a good idea. I think that once this bank is properly managed and all of the safeguards are put in place, that it will serve a useful purpose in helping us in our development of the blue and green economies. But Mr. President, I don't want to sound like a pessimist, but when I sort of was looking at this legislation and thinking about the blue-green bank, something came back to me. I remember there was a bank back in the 70s and the 80s, which was established in Barbados, the Barbados Development Bank, I think it was called. And while that was not set up specifically to deal with blue-green economy as this bank is being established to do, that was intended to develop or certainly to spur development in areas like manufacturing and tourism and so on. And it didn't work out for several reasons. A few of the reasons, for example, it turned out that it was undercapitalized, for example. It turned out that there were too many political loans. People with political connections could go to the bank and they got loans. And then eventually, those loans were not serviced, so the debts became, those debts became bad, had to be written off, and that eroded the capital of the bank. There were loans which were approved and given out, but really in terms of those loans, when you look at them, And when they were analyzing, you said, but you know, these were not really what we call in the finance sector. They were not bankable projects. And all of these contributed to the demise of the bank. So I'm saying that as we look to this new bank and we have to make sure that the structure of the bank is such that these issues which occurred back then do not find themselves as issues in this new bank. And I think that I'm not suggesting, Mr. President, so I don't want anybody to jump up and accuse me of misleading, so I'm not suggesting that, you know, there be political loans or something like that handed out under this new bank. I'm not suggesting it, I'm just saying that what has happened in the past. Because I think that from some of the legislation I've seen proposed in this bill, the bank will have to follow the prudential guidelines and so on under the Financial Institutions Act and so on. And so it will to some extent mitigate any bad loan decisions and so on by the bank, and make sure that the bank is doing the proper reporting and making sure that the proper oversight is in place to the governance and so on, hopefully will be in place to mitigate against the issues which had to be grappled with or which were grappled with in the past. So I think that that is important. I also want to make the point, and we don't know, I didn't get a good understanding as to what the level of capital expectation is for this bank. I heard mention made in Senator Monroe Knight's presentation of the government committing to a 50 million, I think it was, 50 million US, 1.5. And we also had, I believe I heard CAF was committed to 2.5 million and the Green
Climate Fund, the Green
and
Climate Fund.
I believe the
Climate
the
Fund.
Green was committed to.
25.
So we got some idea that we may have capital of about 75 million
Yes.
starting out with. And then we heard that for the first time, there's going to be a prospectus issued. And I don't know who is going to be targeted, who are the investors that are going to be targeted in this prospectus. We know for sure that the traditional banking sector has shied away from these type of green and blue energy type investments and loans because they tend not to provide the level of profitability. The returns tend to be low and it takes a long time, much longer period to recover. So I'm wondering who specifically is going to be targeted to raise the level of capital that will be necessary. Certainly we cannot do it, or I don't think that with the requirements for funding in the green and blue economy is going to be met on $75 million. And of course, in the legislation, the proposed legislation itself, loans are going to be restricted to a maximum of 25% of the base capital of the bank. So unless we have sizable amounts of capital, and it would have been interesting to hear who are these potential investors that are going to be targeted, unless we are going to start out with substantial capital base, I fear that we will end up with another entity which will be undercapitalized and which will defeat the whole purpose for which it was set up. Because if we are hoping to get all of these environmental friendly projects and so on going, if we were to be able to meet our 2030 goals, it is going to be important that this bank will be in a position to largely help with the financing of those projects. So we need to understand that. We need to know that the bank is going to be adequately capitalized to do its work. We need to know that the governance and the overall management of this bank is going to be of a very high level, very transparent, that we're not going to see the issues which occurred in the past reoccurring, and that you will see serious professional and technical management to be able to make sure that projects which are brought forward for financing are really good, sensible projects that would qualify for financing from this bank. And so I support, as I said at the beginning, I support the legislation. I just want to see that we are cautious and that we cover all of these issues and pitfalls which have occurred in the past, and that we don't see them recurring in this case. And with those few words, Mr. President, I'm obliged.
Thank you very much, Senator Nuss. Other speakers? Is there other speakers? Senator Dr. Moran, please wrap up.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. And let me also thank all of the honourable senators who would have participated in the debate throughout the day. As usual, the debate demonstrated for the most part that people fully engaged the bill before us and understood the magnitude of the proposal before us, its importance, and the scope of its impact and potential benefits as well. Mr. President, I wanted to be able to respond to some of the questions that were posed directly, and if you would permit, I will do so in a broad way, highlighting specifically some of the issues raised by particular senators, but I believe that there were some issues that were raised by a number of senators, so I will address them in that stead. First, the issue of transparency and accountability that was raised, and that was raised by Senator Nuss, Senator Malalou, and in part as well, Senator Drakes. And I want, Mr. President, first of all, to provide some assurance. I think it was Senator Malalou himself in his presentation, who again alluded to the fact that yes, we had previous experience with the Development Bank, but also as well recognized that the provisions within this bill offer some assurance that the government was thoughtful in its approach and would have learned from those experiences and therefore applied within the bill measures that would provide for to help to mitigate that circumstance. I want, Mr. President, to identify clause 3.1, which states that the purpose of the Act is to establish a mechanism functioning with minimal involvement of the government to facilitate the financing of clients, explicitly stating that the mechanism is to function with that minimal involvement. I also as well, Mr. President, want to go to clause 27.3, just in relation to, again, transparency, accountability, and reporting. And to note at that clause 27.3, again, Senator Malalu would allude to the fact that there was reports, and he was asking about the extent to which those reports would actually be published. That actually at 27.3, it states that within 4 months of the close of each financial year, the bank shall publish a report providing information on to the extent to which the bank has been able to implement its environmental, social, and government strategies and goals, and also as well to deal with the impact of its business on the environment. Additionally, Mr. President, at clause 35.1, investment mandates and policies, it also indicates that, of course, the bank must develop its policies, but it goes on to say at 2 that copies of the policies referred to in section 1 shall be published on the bank's website as well. And also as well in the call for greater clarity on who will have access and criteria, etc. I also wanted to point out to the Honourable Chamber that at 38, it indicates that the Minister will make recommendations, regulations, generally for giving effect to the provisions of the Act. There was also a question, Mr. President, in respect of who this Act, this bill, was meant to cater to. At 8.1, it clearly says that the bank shall offer wholesale banking services only to other banks and financial institutions, government agencies, real estate developers, and similar enterprises as the bank may determine. That clause identifies specifically who are the potential clients. And Mr. President, I know that the records, certainly from my presentation, would indicate that I had said that those groups of taxi persons or ZRs could lobby a government agency in order to be able to present a proposal as well in order to be able to access funding. The legislation is clear in that respect. I also, Mr. President, want to respond to the questions that were asked in terms of the specific focus on real estate, and to indicate I believe that itself was asked and also answered, because again, I believe it was Senator Malalu and others who identified that there are many areas in which the traditional banking sector, in which the private sector does not enter, because one, it will not be able to deliver them the benefits quickly and at scale as they would want. And therefore, the government has to take, particularly when it comes to providing, I'm going to use now, Mr. President, a phrase that we all know, a piece of the rock for all Barbadians. And that has to be one of the signal priorities in terms not only of providing affordable housing, but also as well resilient housing, Mr. President. And therefore, it was already signaled that this is one, the HOPE ownership program is one of the priority areas for funding that the government is intended to put on the table. I wanted as well, Mr. President, noting that Madam Deputy Speaker had addressed it, but just wanted to come back to it again. That whole notion of government's lack of data, lack of statistics, etc. Mr. President, during the presentation by the Senator Drakes, I quickly went on my laptop and I put in Barbados. I want to be very careful here in terms of what I put in so that I can, I put in National Environmental and Conservation Trust Barbados. That's all I did. I didn't call anybody, Mr. President. I didn't have special access to any information, Mr. President. I didn't go anywhere, Mr. President. I didn't leave the chamber. All I did was type in, as I said before, those words, and immediately a website came up. That website provided information in relation to the operations of the trust. It provided examples of the grants that was given. And by doing further search, it took me to another site of the Conservation Collective, and that Conservation Collective then provided me with an introduction of all of the grants that had been provided to date under the National Environmental and Conservation Trust for Barbados, Mr. President. I also as well, Mr. President, while listening, also as well, on my laptop, typed in Coastal Zone Management Unit data. That's what I put in. And it took me, Mr. President, to a project under the Coastal Zone Management Unit called Coastal Risk Assessment and Management Program, where it identified that program operating since over 2012 to 2020 had provided a coastal risk assessment, monitoring, and management as one of the components of that broader program. And, Mr. President, under that component, guess what? Guess what? That component one was designed to provide updated and new qualitative and quantitative data on coastal processes and coastal risk, and the development of the state-of-the-art tools for systematic, routine, and efficient use of quantitative risk information. Mr. President, just to give you an outline, again, on that website of the areas in which data was collected for, it provided data on a nearshore wave study, was conducted in order to develop a reliable island-wide non-hurricane nearshore wave climatology for Barbados. It did a circulation and water quality study, a sediment transport study, a geotechnical surveys and investigation, a shoreline change study, a comprehensive risk evaluation study, and a national coastal risk platform. Mr. President, because it took me to that national coastal risk platform, I again, just using my Google, found the National Coastal Risk Information and Planning Platform, NCRIPP.
Mr. President.
Google.
Yes,
I
what
don't
do you
usually interrupt persons when they're making contributions, but I have to, on a point of elucidation. What the senator is describing I should say, plans, management strategies, and risk assessments are different from data sets. Mm-hmm. That is what I was speaking to, specific data sets, data points, and trends, Mr. President. So to stay here, to stand and mislead persons that this data in the form of reporting, which has a lot of qualitative information, is disingenuous.
Mr. President, as I indicated, and I quoted from the study, Mr. President, it says new qualitative and quantitative data. I am not thinking, Mr. President, I am not pulling it out of my hat, Mr. President. I'm actually quoting from the site that is here. Mr. President, it indicates a nearshore wave study which has data sets, Mr. President, as part of the data. I also, Mr. President, want to remind the House that we would have debated the Biodiversity National Strategy and Action Plan. We would have debated that. Again, just by Google, that is all I put in. And that Biodiversity Data and Action Plan, when you put it up, also as well provides data, and I don't know if maybe I am misinterpreting what data means, Mr. President. And I can even provide, because I made sure that I have it here on my laptop open, but it provides data on the level of species, it provides data on the plants and the flora and fauna, and how much we have, how much we stand to risk. Mr. President, I am not here at all saying that we have all of the data that we need. that the data systems function perfectly, that there is not a need for greater integration. And as Madam Deputy Speaker also indicated, that of course, Mr. President, we need to be able to work on having access. But what I am showing, Mr. President, what I am showing is that there are ongoing efforts by the government in order to be able to do the level of, because I think you do studies and then studies give data. I may be incorrect. That's the only way that I know, Mr. President, that's the only way that I know. That the government is undertaking the studies in order to provide some of that baseline data and also as well, both qualitative and quantitative. And I do not, Mr. President, also want us to then also not underestimate the value of qualitative data, if there it is that exists, because that can also provide useful information, Mr. President. And the evidence is here. Like I said, did not call anybody, did not go to the chamber. I Googled, Mr. President. Mr. President, the other point I believe that was made as well is, again, that whole issue I think that I spoke to already, just in terms of the focus, just in terms of the capitalization. So, Mr. President, I think we all know, $75 million US, it's not going to capitalize and it's not going to fully provide for all of the resources that will be needed. It can't. But what it provides is for us to be able to start up a mechanism that then can be able to, as was indicated, develop a prospectus, continue to be able to have negotiations, and then to be able to mobilize and crowd in the resources under the conditions as specified in the legislation before us, Section 8, under those conditions, to then to be able, like I said, to mobilize and to crowd in those resources. We would all know as well, Mr. President, that the legislation also makes provisions, again, for the subscription of shares, again, allowing for another mechanism for the bank to be capitalized as well. But what we have here, Mr. President, is a start. What we have here, Mr. President, is an intervention that it is intended, as we've all said and all agreed, to provide for Barbados to be able not to have to be dependent on the international community alone in terms of mobilizing funds, because we all understand the restrictions. Mr. President, some of us who've worked within the international community know that when you go, even for grant funding, to many of the grant agencies, how many hoops you have to jump over. Mr. President, I have been in fora where I have heard countries say that sometimes even just to get what they call the initial concept note takes years, 5 years, Mr. President. 5 years, Mr. President. Well, this was quick. Yeah. This was quick. Yeah. But 5 years people are waiting on a concept note, and you can imagine how much damage you can have over 5 years. So that this provides us with a mechanism, therefore, that we are able to better manage, to provide the resources taken into consideration, the provisions that are here, but providing the necessary framework. I also want to note that the legislation before us makes provision for an investment committee. It makes provision for that investment committee to be able to advise the bank, again, because there are also questions in terms of who will make determinations and if we have the necessary capacity. And if you look, Mr. President, at the schedule and the qualifications, Mr. President, of the board, we're talking about people, Mr. President, in banking and finance, venture capital, economics, engineering, energy technology, and so on, in order to be able to have the necessary capacity. Mr. President, I also note that, of course, The issue of human resource capacity and technology is an overarching concern, yeah, for all of us. But there are different strategies by which the government will strive to be able to tackle those concerns. And we can't always, in the framework of the bank, also as well tackle every single issue. But certainly, Mr. President, the government is aware that we will need to ensure that we have those human and technical resources available to us, that we can carry out the projects and develop the projects, but that is an ongoing challenge that we will have to confront again on an ongoing basis. Mr. President, as I close, again, let me thank all of the honourable senators for their support of this bill. Again, saying that I am extremely proud that we are here in this moment with this innovative financing mechanism. Once again, the government of Barbados demonstrating that it is ready to meet the task, that it understands that the challenge that we face requires that we not do the same, that we not do traditional, but that we seek to make sure that we are developing mechanisms that move the ladder in relation to addressing that fundamental issue of climate finance. Mr. President, I beg that this bill be read a second time.
The question is that this bill be read a second time. Will all honourable senators in favour please say aye? Aye. Those against please say no. The ayes have it. Senator Mulroney.
Mr. President, I beg that Your Honour now leave the chair and the Senate resolves itself into committee for further consideration of this bill.
The question is that I do not leave the chair and the Honourable the Senate resolve itself in the committee for further consideration of this bill. Will all honourable senators in favour please say aye? Aye. Those against please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
The Senate is now in committee.
Madam Chair, may we take the bill in parts?
Permission granted.
Part 1, clauses 1 through 4.
Madam Chair, I beg that clause 1 through 4, part 1 through 4, do not stand part.
The question is that parts 1 through 4 do now stand part. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, would you please say no?
No.
Honourable Senator Drake, the chair recognizes you.
Thank you, Chair. Chair, I'd like to bring our attention to clause 2 under interpretation, where 2 definitions are given that I would like to propose amendments for. The first is the definition for blue economy, and it says blue economy means the sustainable use of ocean resources to benefit economies, livelihoods, and ocean ecosystem health. The proposed amendment, blue economy means the
No, sorry, people would need to write.
Oh, I have it written here for the clerks.
But as you're saying it, I think people would still want to write, so.
Okay, no problem. The proposed change.
Yes, thank you.
Apologies. I am guilty of speaking fast. The proposed change is blue economy means the sustainable use of ocean resources to benefit economies, livelihoods, and that either preserves or regenerates ocean ecosystem health. That is the first proposed amendment to the change in definition of blue economy. And Chair, these things are vital because when we have words, they have meanings, particularly as it relates to the standard that we set when we consider a business to be part of the blue economy. If it is not preserving, if it is not regenerating ocean ecosystem health, it should not be considered a part of the blue economy. The second proposed amendment, Chair, is for the definition of the green economy. It states, at present, the green economy means the kind of economy that reduces environmental risks and ecological dangers by encouraging economic activity that does not degrade the environment. Chair, I am asking for the amendment of that definition as follows. The green economy means the kind of economy that reduces environmental risk and ecological threats by encouraging economic activity that does not degrade or that preserves or regenerates the environment, Chair.
Thank you very much, Senator. I'm going... Honourable Senator and the clerk are conferring, the deputy clerk.
I'll second it for the application, record application.
The amendment, proposed amendments are being seconded by Honourable Senator Kevin Boyce. And I'm going to ask that the clerks copy and circulate the proposed amendments, which are not slight, so that people have the opportunity to look at them or read them and digest them. That's why I asked the Honourable Senator to go slowly. So we are going to take so it has to be copied on everybody, it has to be circulated to everybody. It just cannot be passed around the table like this. So we're going to take a 10-minute suspension to...
Madam Deputy Chair, I think I'm just a little bit, let's let that clarity, because I'm appreciative that the Honourable Senator has proposed the amendments, but I'm not sure what's the basis for the proposal of the amendments as yet. So again, a simple Google, again, so the definition there are several definitions for blue economy, for instance. And I am therefore unclear of what makes the amendment by the Honourable Senator the amendment that we should. I also want to note, Madam Deputy Chair, that this actual definition that is within this legislation is actually taken from the World Bank. Actually taken from the World Bank's definition of blue economy. I also want to indicate that the definitions would have been informed again through the development
Honourable
of
Senator,
the concept note.
I'm interrupting you because the points you're making, interesting or legitimate as they may be, are the points that you would need to make after we've all had an opportunity to see the amendment and for us to make decisions on it. We cannot have a presentation on something that is really not before us. I don't think that anybody was able to take and fully appreciate the Honourable Senator's argument. So that we are taking a 10-minute suspension, awaiting the copy of the proposed amendment so that we can come back and the committee can litigate the matter fully. Because I do not wish it to be said that the Honourable Senators we made light thrift, or the Senate made light thrift, or did not properly evaluate or treat with courtesy or respect or anything of the sort. And therefore, the mechanism I'm proposing will allow everybody to see it at the same time, analyze it, and come back and make their arguments, and then we will have to vote, and there will be due process. I'm not going to hear arguments. Are on recess. It is 20 minutes to 5 o'clock, maybe more like 17 minutes to 5 o'clock. So we are in we cannot break. Okay. So for the benefit of the public, we are being guided by the clerk that as chair of the committee, I cannot of my own volition take the decision to break, that the opportunity, a motion has to be moved for the break, and then we can make that decision. And I am encouraging. Yeah, we still have to look at it. We still have to look at it. So I'm encouraging.
I would make that proposal that the Senate in committee takes a break, further consider the proposal by Senator Drakes.
Madam, I second that.
Thank you very much, honourable senators, and I'm sure that you will appreciate that this is really a matter of equity and justice, and we want to be fair. So we will resume at 5 minutes. We will resume at 5 o'clock. We will resume at 5 o'clock. Do I have clerk to ask, do we have to let the president come again?
Yes.
Okay, so somebody has to move that as well. Yes.
Madam Deputy Chair, I would like to move that we report.
The question is that consideration of the bill before the chamber be now postponed, and we ask for leave to sit again. All those in favor? Aye. Those against? The ayes have it. So the president will return, we will break until 5, and we will resume using the usual process.
The Deputy President has reported progress and begged for leave to sit again.
Mr. President, I beg that this session be suspended until 5 p.m.
Second that.
The question is that this sitting be suspended until 5 p.m. today. All honourable senators in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Those against, please say no. The ayes have it. This sitting is accordingly suspended until 5 p.m. today.